Okay, so tonight we are talking about Plessy versus Ferguson. Your notes are going to go on page 34 in your notebook, and I'm on pages 382 through 383 in the book, and you can also find stuff about Plessy versus Ferguson on page 964 in your book. All right, this will go in your vocabulary section of your notebook. You have 5 vocabulary words. The first one's disenfranchising, poll tax, grandfather clause, segregation, and Jim Crow laws. All of these can be found in the glossary. Try to put them into your own words and make sure it's in the vocabulary section of your notebook. All right, so after the Civil War, many Southerns were upset about the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments that allowed African American communities certain civil rights. One of those rights was the right to vote for African American males. The Southern officials used a loophole in the 15th Amendment and figured out how to disenfranchise the African Americans. Disenfranchising just means to deprive a person the right of citizenship as of the right to vote. Mississippi was the first state to take the first step in disenfranchising the African Americans. They made all citizens pay a $2 poll tax and pass a literacy test. The literacy test was not an easy test to pass. It was reading the state constitution, and if you were an African American, they would give you super hard passages to read. This led to a huge decline in African Americans who were registered to vote in the South. Whites had a hard time passing the literacy test also and paying the poll tax, so they were given a break in the literacy test and the poll tax by a so-called grandfather clause. And a grandfather clause was that any man could vote if he had an ancestor, like a grandfather, hint, hint, on the voting rolls in 1867. So 1867 is only 2 years after the Civil War. So you would have a high unlikelihood that any African American males could vote. All right, segregation. Segregation means separation of the races. It was not limited to the South. The North had barred most African Americans from public places. In the South, the laws that enforced discrimination and segregation were known as the Jim Crow laws. There was a Civil Rights Act of 1875 that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race and selecting jurors for trials. But the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment said no state could deny civil rights to a person, but that did not mean that private citizens could not practice segregation. This decision led to a decline in congressional support for civil rights, and Southern states began to pass a series of laws to enforce segregation. So in 1883, the Civil Rights Act of 1865 was basically a non-issue. Then in 1892, an African American named Homer Plessy challenged the segregation laws in Louisiana. The case went to the Supreme Court, and it reinforced segregation for the next 50 years until 1954 when the Plessy decision was overturned in Brown versus the Board of Education. So with the Civil Rights Act of 1875 being a non-issue, we have Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was an African American male who lived in Louisiana, and in 1890, Louisiana passed a statute called the Separate Car Act, where you would have different races riding separate cars. And the Plessy case went to court, backed by several different committees trying to get it ruled unconstitutional. John Howard Ferguson was the judge presiding over the Plessy criminal case in the district court. He had previously declared the Separate Car Act unconstitutional on trains that traveled through several states. However, in Plessy's case, he decided that the state could choose to regulate railroad companies that operated solely within the state of Louisiana. Therefore, Ferguson found Plessy guilty and declared the Separate Car Act constitutional. Plessy appealed the case to the Louisiana State Supreme Court, which affirmed the decision that the Louisiana law was constitutional. Then he went all the way to the Supreme Court. Judge John Howard Ferguson was named to the case brought before the United States Supreme Court, hence the reason it's called Plessy versus Ferguson, because he had been named in the petition in the Louisiana Supreme Court, and not because he was part of the initial lawsuit. In 1896, the Supreme Court upheld the Louisiana law and expressed a new legal doctrine endorsing separate but equal facilities for African Americans. The ruling established the legal basis for discrimination in the South for more than 50 years to come. However, separate but equal was not always maintained in the South. Most of the accommodations in the South were inferior. The impact of the Plessy decision was the heightened discrimination of African Americans in the South, which also halted the progression of the African Americans. You also had violence toward African Americans, and whites and African Americans were charged differently during criminal cases. There were not equal facilities, even though Plessy's decision was separate but equal. You also had segregated military units, and you have the onset of the NAACP. So as you can see, Plessy versus Ferguson was a monumental Supreme Court case that you need to remember. And that's the end. Y'all have a fabulous day.